So it's a different thing to imitate and reproduce, like, so you might want to try to reproduce the system such that it imitates, but it doesn't mean that like you necessarily aim at imitating when you reproduce some aspects of the system. So typically, at least, I mean, within philosophy of science discussions, imitation is ascribed to simulations, but then modeling doesn't necessarily even try to imitate anything. You might want to just like, when you model, isolate some part of the system and study its functioning on its own. So I think, I mean, it's a little bit like, I'd say, too general way he talks about models and simulations without really making a big difference between the two. Then he talks about models as idealizations and abstractions, and that is obviously the way in which philosophers of science have as well approached models. So here then, like, so what is an idealization? He's not explaining it, and neither abstraction. The usual way in which philosophers of science discuss about idealizations and abstractions, and by the way, I don't ascribe to this view, but the usual way is the following. Idealization is a kind of a distortion. You distort the system in order to make it mathematically tractable. That is the typical way in which the notion of idealization is being used. Whereas then the abstraction is usually used in such a way that you omit something, like it's the classical understanding of abstraction, that you omit something from the system. And by omitting something from the system, you arrive at a more abstract representation. This is discussed in a couple of passages. There was one passage in which Dupuy says, a model is an abstract form that is embodied or instantiated by phenomena. And I was entirely puzzled, but then later on when he talked about abstraction, it came closer to how I understand abstraction, because I don't really know how a model would be as an abstract form embodied or instantiated by a phenomenon. That sounded really strange to me. But there was a latter instance in which he talks actually about abstraction. Let me see, try to find now the paper. Let me see where it was. Yeah, model abstracts from phenomenal reality the system of functional relation that it judges to be the sole pertinent ones. Well, not necessarily, but at least, I mean, it still abstracts some features or relations from phenomenal reality. And by the way, the phenomenal reality is also somewhat unclear what he's talking about here, because you can make a distinction between phenomenon and then a system that produces a phenomenon. So for instance, you might have, nowadays we talk about the phenomenon of inflation. So you don't understand inflation by trying to tease some like phenomenal parts of like the phenomenon of inflation. No, you try to construct a model of economy, an abstract model of economy that then exhibits something that is akin to inflation. So I would say that one should be quite careful in distinguishing between the mechanism and the phenomenon that is produced by a mechanism. So then Dupuy talks about the fact that we can have many even incompatible models of the same phenomena. But at the same time, we have models that are then being like the one and the same model can be then applied to different phenomena, or actually the same kind of phenomena, but different material systems. So here again, it's really important to be clear on the distinction between phenomenon and then a mechanism. So you might think that there are some phenomena that very many different kinds of systems actually share, and then you can apply to them the same model because because it is being assumed that it's the same kind of mechanism that produces the same kind of phenomena, irrespective of the material makeup of the system. Then he wants to make this kind of reverse there, turning the tables in such a way that, well, because we know better what we actually produce, that is like models. Models are also purer, so it's kind of easier to understand and comprehend. So then, you know, it might be the case that, you know, some way down the line, we think that like it's nature that is imitating our models. So models become somehow ontologically primary. This is what seems to be happening here as well. Then finally, he has all these very strange formulations in which, like in the end, he's talking about simulation is a simulation of simulation, with like Derrida's critique of Searle. I don't know how much more understanding is created by these kinds of formulations. I mean, you know, it's witty perhaps, but, you know, from my perspective, I don't know whether I actually got any kind of, I would say, epistemic surplus from these formulations. What was interesting here was his mentioning it was in the page 40, if you go to the page 40, where am I now? I'm somewhere in a very wrong place. Let me. Well, I just don't seem to be finding it from anywhere, but it is here. So I paid attention to like him writing about mind as the model of the faculty of modeling. So once again, models of modeling. Now, I would say that from philosophy of science perspective, we model the mind as the model of the faculty of modeling. So here we actually could even add one more notion of modeling to this formulation. So basically what's happening here, we model the mind. So the mind is modeling such that, that we consider mind as that we consider like, whatever we model, whatever we like model it with it, like a model that then models the faculty of modeling. And you know, once again, he seems to be liking this model of a model of a model. I hear actually myself added here one model, precisely because after that he goes on then to ask whether Turing machine is a model of a mind or is it a mind? And obviously it does. He obviously wants to say that it's not not a mind, but like our model of a mind, a way of mechanizing the mind. You know, one way of like making that. And I guess, I mean, his main critique here of modeling is precisely us taking like models as for something that is real and not recognizing that what's happening here is like the activity of modeling. That's basically what I wanted to say about modeling here in this article. And Andrea has done a lot of work in writing or making as a PowerPoint presentation than on the Turing machine part of this section.
Yeah, so
Can you share your screen?
yeah, this will be good. And how can I now upload?
You share your screen, like this green one.
Yeah, I do this, but it's
And then you just choose your presentation from your screen.
but it's not showing. The presentation is not showing.
No, you need to open it in a different window. If you've got it on the same monitor, but on a different window.
I have it. Yeah, I have it on the same monitor. Wait. I'm sorry for this. It's always it. So here's a presentation and share screen. It seems to think that I have, it shows Microsoft PowerPoint unknown. It shows also unknown.
Andrea, if you, I can also share it from my screen.
But I sent you the new one. I have to first go in systems preferences.
I have the new version
and allow
of
it.
slides.
Okay, then yeah, then send, you know, if you can upload only the part I did.
Yeah, I mean it's only now
Yeah,
the version that you just sent me.
Yeah.
Like half an hour ago. So
Yeah.
this one, right? Okay, in that case, I am doing it, and then you have to always say to me when I change the slide, right?
Okay, I do this.
Good. Yes, so here we go. You see it, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good, great.
Okay, so I have to say that I had a little bit of a problem also with the reading, but in the end, what I, you know, the critique Tarja presented, so there was one thing which I wanted to really, you know, interesting was this kind of tension he has there, because he's on the one hand, he's making this point very strongly that, you know, that we learn about that we learn about a target by constructing it. So this is where he talks about this, where he also quotes Hannah Arendt. And so we learn about a cognitive system by constructing cognitive systems, or to construct a model of a cognitive systems. And here also he makes a difference between, you know, when you try to understand something in physics, what you do is you try to imitate the system via the model, where the, you know, as Tarja pointed out, this notion of imitation has really, you know, it's really problematic here, and needs to be further, you know, discussed at this point. But what I'm thinking, what he tries to do is to present us a critique about this kind of mechanization of the mind. And I think we talked about this the last session. And, you know, the Turing machine as a model of the mind, I think it's a, you know, it's a very illustrative example for, you know, how scientists, you know, and as he also described, were misled by the idea that the Turing machine could something, you know, could be regarded as a model of thinking, or this, that's computation could be equated with thinking. But he also, you know, because he also takes his historical view, what he did was, you know, to remind people, to saying that, you know, this this thinking about, cognitive science, and there's a history behind this Turing machine, and which becomes related to cognitive science, which goes further back in time than just to the moment when the first Turing machine had been constructed or when Turing presented this model. And the whole thing started with what is known as Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem. So it comes from mathematics. So Hilbert is a very, very well-known mathematician, and he had this idea, or this kind of some kind of a dream, maybe it's a dream of every mathematician, is that you can, completely formalize mathematics. And so it was, I think it was in 1920s where he formulated what is called his Entscheidungsproblem. And to bring it to the point, what it entails is that every statement in mathematics, is every statement in mathematics decidable? This is the kind of question he asked. So, and Hilbert wanted to know whether there exists a procedure. In this case, it's important to think about it as an algorithm that can be applied to every statement and tell us about the truth or falsity of the statement in finite time. And this is also important, that it's in infinite time. So, and it was Gödel with his very, famous incompleteness theorem, which he was able to show that this is not the case. There is, as long as one stays in the consistent formal system, there will be always statements that are true, but that are unprovable in the system. So they cannot be decided. So in order to be able to decide it, one would have to get out of this system, of this formal system of mathematics. So this was really a problem. And the other problem, even Gödel's incompleteness theorem is, I think one of the most important theorems in mathematics. But, as Dupuy describes it, what was missing was a notion of effective computation. This means a kind of, algorithm by which this could be shown, that there are statements, from which we cannot decide if they are, even if they are true, we cannot, prove that they are true in the system. So now the next slide. So, and another thing which was then important for the next step, this, finding or looking for this kind of algorithm was what is called the arithmetization of this formal system of a logical system. And this means that you could present something like a procedure by which you go, through the different steps of proving or trying to prove if a statement is true or it's not true. So you could say, step one is these logical steps, step two, and so far and so on. And this was the first step into the direction of coming up with the algorithm, which in the end was something, was reached by seeing the analogy, or taking, not an analogy, but taking as a model, taking machines and the mechanisms in machines. So this procedure should be something which should, which is similar to these kind of blind mechanisms which one observes in machine. This is what Dupuy says, Dupuy says, and which applied then to, which considering him applied to Turing. Next. So, and before Turing, and that's an interesting point, before Turing then started to construct his machine, he thought about, this is what people say, he thought about, how humans are working through calculations. And, in a calculation, as you all know, you have a finite number of symbols with which you work, and you have discrete states of mind that can switch in between when you are doing your calculations in your mind, and you have a paper on which you perform the calculation and record the results. So, and this he translated into a machine. Next. Which looks like this. I think you more or less, everybody of you is familiar with the Turing machine, where you have these endless string of paper, and you have this machine which can be in a specific configuration, and you have this head which is moving over this paper, and you have digitals, zeros and ones, and the head is reading the zeros and ones, and you have instructions, how having the input state, how to move forward. These instructions can be, for example, when there is a blank instruction, when blank symbol is read, instruction when zero symbol is read. No, wait, that's not true. So right, this is the kind of the instruction is how the head is moving back as a forward or backwards, or stays the same, or if the digitals are erased, or digital is written on the tape. So this kind of procedure, which is kind of mechanism, and blind mechanism, because the machine doesn't know what it's doing. It's just we are giving it the instruction. So you can solve computational problems. And the question was, would this kind of machine allow to give an answer to the Entscheidungsproblem? And trying to become not too technical, but what you next. Or before I come to this, so Dupuy write about it that Turing turned Hilbert's question, does there exist an effective general procedure by which it would be possible to determine whether a particular formula or the predicate calculus is provable or not, into does there exist a machine capable of deciding whether or not such a formula is provable? So as I said before, he turned it in this kind of, mechanistic version of solving the problem. So, okay. And to show if this Entscheidungsproblem was solvable by the Turing machine, Turing had to solve these, what is called the halting problem, which means you have two Turing machines, and one Turing machine is going through the problem, and the other Turing machine would give an halt at some point when the problem is solved. So, and because this doesn't exist, so there is no way of to make these decisions in the system. So that would mean, because the string is endless, the machine would go on for endless times. So there is nothing from, as I said, would put it to an halt. So, and then the question was at this point, how to get from formal mathematics to cognitive science. And next, Tarja. This is the next one. And here, we are entering, or following Dupuy, we are entering this era of cybernetics. And here the mind, or rather each of the various faculties that make it up, was conceived as a Turing machine operating on the formulas of a private internal analogous language, analogous to the formal language in logic. So the focus was on the relation of the mind and the machine. So instead of looking at the mind, of the relation of mind and matter. And one of the problems which came to it when you just look at this, at this machine and with its symbols and with its instructions. So John von Neumann criticized that, how, at this point, so how do we get meaning to the symbols? So where's the semantic? The semantic was not part of this model of the mind. So next. And it becomes clear that there comes, this Turing model, when you talk about the mind, it comes with a lot of tension. And one of the, just this question of if we should then, as a consequence, if you regard the Turing model or the Turing machine as a model of the mind, then would mean that the faculties of the mind should be understood as rule governing mechanical processes, as a blind or stupid automatism. So nobody from us would like to, to regard themselves as, just following this kind of stupid and blind mechanical processes. So, and the focus had been, as I said before, between thought and machine. And, an alternative reading, as it comes from the artificial intelligence, would be that logical discoveries, or man as being able creating an artificial brain or mind. So would the Turing machine could also be, a kind of a starting point for artificial intelligence, and which was, as this quote from Herbert Simon shows, which was really the case. So a lot of scientists at that time thought about in this direction, and which Dupuy said it was just, it's not the right way to look at it. Next. So the Turing machine has been crucial in initiating research of mechanistic and materialistic science of mind, but at the same time, it cannot be known if the algorithm generative principles can be understood as knowledge. So I think one more time, this kind of tension becomes clear here. So we don't know how this, if there is a kind of, if you could even make a connection between mechanism and the material, the material basis of the cognitive system or cognitive science. So next. So, and then he introduces, or he introduces something as knowing as simulating, and it took me some time to understand what he means. So he starts out with this universal Turing machine, where you have different Turing machines, simulating each other. So, but in order to be able to simulate, you have to know. You cannot simulate something which you don't have any knowledge about. So should we then rather understand, when we're not talking about thinking, but about knowing, and in this context about simulating. So this would be a switch from, the mind who is performing computation to something in the mind which is knowing via simulating. So this is how I understand it. We can discuss this later, so maybe I'm totally off here at this point. So next. So thinking is computation, can be replaced by knowing is simulation, and the two meanings of simulating, which, according to Dupuy, existent for him is as a form of modeling that consists in replication or as a make-believe. So these are the two different meanings which come with this term. And he said that the verum factum, this that we only can know by constructing, or we can only know things which we have been constructing, puts some kind of confusion into this term of simulation. And simulation means to know. We have to already know, and this verum factum, as this has been discussed before, says that we only know via the construction. So how these two things, how do they come together? And frankly, I don't understand how this should be. And he then, this this game, he's done this imitation game, which is then which he is describing, and maybe there is a kind of answer to it, because it's not only that you have the observer, the C, and you have a person and the computer is trying, know on the basis of the knowledge of how human beings, how they behave, he tries to simulate to be a human being, but in such a way that the observer cannot distinguish between the two anymore. So, but Turing adds, a second level by saying it's not only that we have this computer, but this computer, you have men and women. And, as a man, the computer tries to simulate being a woman so that the observer cannot distinguish between human, and he cannot distinguish between, if it's a man or cannot see a difference between men. No, it's betrayed by, that he thinks it's a woman, but the computer, is set up as being a man. It's confusing, these different layers. I'm sorry, it's late. So for him, it is this kind of that we only know that we can model. We know about our faculty of knowing via modeling. I'm sorry, I found this very, maybe we can discuss this, but I always get a nod in my head with these different layers he's putting up all the time. So, and coming to the last point he's discussing, and this is his Chinese room experiment or thought experiment. And I think you more or less, about this thought experiment and how it works. And third argument that he says, with this man in the room, so he doesn't understand any word of Chinese, and he's just following his instruction book in answering the question which are, handed to him from outside, and he delivers answers back outside, and the person outside thinks he speaks perfect Chinese, but he's just following some rules, but he doesn't really know. And I think this brings it nicely to a point, what's the problem with the Turing machine. And when we talk about computation and thinking, or equating these two, that a Turing machine is just following instructions, and it's nothing about knowing, or not something about thinking and being creative. And for me, the whole chapter was about this kind of tension between this very mechanistic model, and when you talk about or think about knowing and thinking as a creative act. Okay, that's it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for that very detailed presentation. Now, would you like to suggest some topics for the discussion, or should I try and throw something out there? I think you are more knowledgeable. I had my problem was I'm totally coming from outside and had to really try to get myself into this. And maybe it would be good if you, as someone who was more knowledgeable about it, choose some topics which you think. Okay, I mean, I would dispute the point of being more knowledgeable. I'm also somewhat from outside. This is my first reading of this book, actually. And I wouldn't say I'm that involved in cognitive science, more narrowly understood.
but more in phenomenology and philosophy of mind. But with that in mind, one thing that I found interesting that I would like to point out, of course, given that this is my first reading, I haven't yet read the part where he talks about phenomenology, which I will read and then present fairly soon. But one thing that seems interesting here is that the way he develops his thought, and also the way he points out Vico and the notion of modeling, notion of verum factum as this sort of crucial shift in the anatomy of science, so to speak. It reminds me a lot of Husserl in The Crisis, where he also locates sort of the fundamental shift in Galileo and the notion of nature being something that we can make mathematical, something that we can idealize through mathematical description. So I think in some sense it's a point that's somewhat parallel to that of Husserl. So that's something that I found interesting. And also just in general, one fascinating aspect is how much he there's a lot of depth of content in terms of philosophy of science more broadly, and that's something where I am slightly more familiar with, at least. Yeah, sometimes some conceptual distinctions that he makes are they leave a person wanting a bit more of a detailed explanation. He's not always completely 100% clear and concise, but overall, there is a sort of this interesting kind of depth that goes beyond just the project of providing a new history of cognitive science, essentially. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? How he relates to, well, maybe on the one hand Husserl, and maybe on the other hand philosophy of science more broadly?
So maybe I can make a little point about the philosophy of science with the modeling. What, you said that sometimes he's not concise, and what I recognize was when he's talking about abstraction and idealization. So it's I cannot distinguish between abstraction and idealization. So because he describes it both in the same terms, that you try to extract, or the different, the structure, the relations between the components in the system. So this is, as far as I understand, it's for him, he is the notion of abstraction, and also he discusses it when it comes to the notion of idealization. So I was just a little bit confused by this, why this should be the same in his thinking. And also he with the entailment, Tarja mentioned the entailment, that these models are entailed in the phenomena. So he's talking about this entailment in the phenomena, but at some point he talks about that models have a life of their own, so that they become independent of the phenomena. So, and I was always a little bit struck of how he moved, from one conception of models and to another.
I think the point on abstraction, idealization, I mean, I've had a bit of a similar impression. I hope it's something that gets at least partly resolved later on. I'm not terribly optimistic, but we'll see. As for models taking on a life of their own, yeah, I think that whole aspect of models being that crucial, I think that's something that could that would deserve to be treated a bit more in depth. And also when I said it, he's not concise, maybe that's not the right word. In a way, he's too concise, I suppose. He's not terribly clear and systematic. That's a better one. Michael?
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Tarja and Andrea, for that presentation. My sense of it was more of it as as a history question that he was trying to engage, rather than like maybe a strictly philosophy of science one. I don't know what you guys think about that. So my reading, as it were, of it was something like, how do we get to this mechanized conception of mind? And in this chapter on models, I understood that he said, right, so first we have this image, or this conception of cognition, or mind, thinking, knowing, as some kind of modeling thing. And when we do that, then it opens up to you know, machines and AI systems and computers being able to do this kind of thing. And you know, a series of inferences roughly of that form, that like, if we think of knowledge and cognition like this, then you know, this is how we get to this mechanized picture of mind. And on the way, it's interesting to hear, like, you guys who know what you're talking about say that he wasn't being very precise. I mean, I couldn't tell you. So that was interesting. But yeah, I guess my sense was that he was moving kind of quickly and slightly ambiguously, or maybe not concisely precise enough over these things, because he was trying to make historical points about how the philosophy of science and the philosophy of mind and cognitive science were all kind of entangled in this basic cultural principle of verum factum that maybe even goes, you know, that Husserl said goes all the way back to Galileo. I had no idea about that. That was really cool. But I don't know. So yeah, if that's true, it makes me feel a bit easier about him moving a bit quickly over these philosophy of science things. I don't know. You think that's what he was trying to do? That he was trying to make this historical sort of view of things?
I think, yeah, at least partly, because sometimes when he talks about history more narrowly, he can be very precise. You know, sometimes he'll go, okay, according to this interpretation, this and that is important, but then criticize it in a very systematic sort of way. So when it comes to the history side of things, I think he's reasonably systematic about it. It's more with the philosophical and epistemological implications that form sort of the depth of of what he's talking about. Those tend to be a bit less clear. Tarja?
Yeah, I totally agree with Michael's interpretation here. The only thing, of course, for a person who has been studying a lot of modeling is like that, is this sophistry of like models of models of models, simulations of simulations of simulations really going to give us, somehow it's taken away from his argument from my perspective, because like you said, I mean, there is a lot of like historical, like many historical things more accurate, and then you are like, why is it wrapped into this like unnecessarily philosophical foil? That's my question there. I mean, without much of that, we could still have understood what's going on here. It might even have delivered the basic point much more efficiently.
That's a nice way of putting it. It's making me, or it's reminding me of is it in the introduction or the preface where he talks about trying to balance the rigor of analytic philosophy or the American academicism with the French intellectualism, and maybe this is one of the areas where the French intellectualism comes through, or something like that.
Definitely. Andrea, do you have something to add?
So, yeah, with his French intellectualism. I totally agree, because especially when it comes to the, I didn't understand what he means that what was it? The history is modeling literature or imitating literature. Is it like this? So I was so puzzled about this when I read this. So this is right on the it's a quote from Borges he's taking here. This is his travel. Yeah. History is only a copy of literature. So I really had a hard time, I still, I don't understand what he wanted to talk, when he wanted to say here. So in the end, I also decided, okay, maybe it's just, this kind of French way of, making these, it sounds great, you have Borges and all these people in the beginning, and then you go on. And I also agree with this point about that he maybe comes from the history side, and he becomes very precise and goes in details when it comes to the Entscheidungsproblem and all these kind of things, to the mathematics, and leaves, all this arithmetization of logic and all this kind of stuff. He just has one sentence about this. And if you miss this sentence, you lose him, you lose the rest of the argument. And it just makes it, it's this peculiar mixture of, technical details, history, and this kind of this French attitude, which I found, I found it hard to read, or make me hard reading, and still I don't understand what was his main point. Wants he really to say that models are the way, because we are constructing models and the Turing model is a model, it's a way of accessing the question of cognitive science, or the area of cognitive science.
Yeah, I mean, when he writes like that, I suppose that occasionally one gets the impression that he's not somehow the worst of both worlds when it comes to the balancing act in particular places. So the only. Do you have something else to add, Andrea?
Yeah, I somehow would like to, to understand. So what's his intention in the end? When he talks about this model, because he has this constructive part, and he talks about, via the construction we learn, and we can only know, from the construction of models. And as Tarja and I always argue, construction is an essential thing. So, but I don't. Does he really want to make the point that the Turing model, even it started out in this mathematical area, that it really contributed to this kind of construction program and constructing a model? And so this is what I have a hard time to see, this line of argumentation. So what brings his thinking about models with what he comes up, or what he wants to say in the end? I don't see the red line in it yet.
So that's actually something that we could discuss, I think. I mean, what did you like? What was the take-home message of this? Somehow, to me, it seemed really like the sentence that somehow draw together like this model discussion and then this Turing machine discussion is like that. He asked whether Turing machine is a model of a mind, or is it the mind? That's what he's saying there. And is the implication there that then many people have taken it to be something like the mind and forgotten that it's actually a model of a mind. That's and a model of a mind that actually presents the faculty of like the mind as some sort of modeling itself. I mean, what did you take this as a takeaway message?
Gregor, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're putting the finger on the issue of this whole chapter, and your presentation made me realize, flipping through the pages a bit more again on what I annotated. I think this notion of embodiment seems to be crucial, maybe to what Dupuy is trying to achieve in the chapter here. Like on page 29 here, he has this formulation that a model is an abstract form, as it were, that is embodied or instantiated by phenomena, which is at odds with all the other practices or usage of those terms we know from contemporary philosophy of science. And maybe I think that for me was now a key sentence to try to make out the key message or strategy of the whole paper there, tying things together. Then that this still, to me, unclear notion of model he has in mind here, it has a lot to do with this fabrication process, manipulating thing, and then embodying them. I'm not sure what exactly he's achieving there, but I think that might be the problem. Also tied together with this embodied connection that Adnan in the beginning mentioned Husserl. I just picked up my copy of The Crisis I had in the first semester of philosophy and never touched it again, hardly understood anything reading it first time. But here in this part 2, there's all this kind of gap between the physicalist objectivism and transcendental subjectivism. Maybe that's the, I think that might be the chapter's takeaway message here, is kind of finding a connection between the subjective and intentional and the mechanistic objective, and doing that through his a bit idiosyncratic notions of what a model could be and how it relates or embodies to phenomenon. But it's always hard to like switch off the meaning we're used to and trying to figure out what's going on here. But I have a feeling it might be something along these lines, or at least that's where I would put my finger, what the take-home message could be of the chapter. But please let's hear other thoughts on that.
Can I ask something? Like, you precisely were puzzled about the same sentence as I was. Like that was the most puzzling sentence to me. The model is an abstract form that is embodied or instantiated by phenomena. I mean, I could understand it, and I could understand what he's claiming if this was changed into the form. A model is an abstract form that can be embodied and instantiated by phenomena, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you can construct these models, these machines. Like the Turing machine was obviously abstract, but then later on, you started to build actual machines and artificial intelligence.
I think then also later on he has some formulations that the Turing model were embodied by Turing machines, and that would be then again a model of the mind. Yeah, but exactly. I think that's might be a key sentence, or at least a key confusing sentence for us.
I mean, in that sense, maybe he hasn't got necessarily physical embodiment in mind here. Maybe he's just using the term in a very sort of incredibly misleading sense, because especially given that he applies it to the Turing machine, maybe he means that in a much broader sense, instantiated by phenomena, where the phenomena in question might even be mental phenomena in a very sort of extreme use of the term instantiate or embody. I mean, instantiate is already a bit clearer. I think it's the word embodied that really kind of drives home the confusion.
But isn't he, coming back to the Turing model? So for me, he was saying that the Turing model is not embodied by the mind, with his because he quotes he has these quotes from scientists where he thinks that they took it too literally, and also with the Chinese room experiment, saying it's and knowing means simulation, so you have to have knowledge. So, and just following the instruction doesn't give you a knowledge. So the Turing machine, the mind is, oh God, how which way around. So the Turing machine is not embodied by the mind for me. So this is what he's, as for me, what he's saying in the end.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what I was saying, and if I'm not mistaken, what Gregor mentioned was that I think he uses the term, the Turing machine embodies a particular understanding of the mind or something like that, or instantiates it. So not that the mind embodies the Turing machine, but rather that the Turing machine embodies a particular approach. That's where the odd use of the word embody comes in, because obviously it's not a sort of physical embodiment in any sense.
Yeah.
But then once it's possible to, I mean, for Turing, it wasn't physical embodiment. And once it's, possible to actually physically embody it, then you get like this 3 different levels, like materiality, and then syntactic and semantic levels together that seem to be like, according to his argument, crucial for cognitivism, as far as I understood rightly what I read.
I completely agree on that point. I mean, maybe it goes to his credit that he can be sort of vague in the sense that having read only the bits that we have read so far, it's not really easy to see what his position is. Hopefully that'll become clearer in future chapters. I don't know if there's anyone here that's read the whole book previously. That would probably be helpful.
I haven't read the whole thing, but I read a few chapters ahead, and in chapter 2 he picks up on some of the themes of this chapter, where the embodiment of the mind gets reused, but in different meanings, referring to one particular author, McCulloch. And I'm just looking at something I also highlighted the same way as the previous sentence, that on page 53, like as we saw in the first chapter, however, the notion of a model retains, even for scientists, the sense of something deserving to be imitated rather than something that simulates. And again, this he seems to revisit the themes, and maybe we'll get a better track on where everything is going in the later chapters a bit.
Yeah, I mean, what you said right there, the model, I also read only a part of the second chapter so far, that the model retains its sense as something worthy to be imitated. Again, I do sort of see that as, like you pointed out, I've also got my copy right here of the Crisis. Maybe it's I don't know. It's one of the more heavily annotated books I've got, and I've just been revisiting it lately. So far, I do see that as sort of the crux of his broader epistemological point. But yeah, it remains to be seen to what extent he really drives that home.
My sense of his thesis in this chapter was that it's part of what the book's trying to do. When the book's, as I understand it, trying to describe this trajectory and this history of ideas to a current
And there seems to be an issue with the internet connection.
mechanized conception of the mind. And one of these first, I see him here sort of identifying one of the first steps, namely this is a, am I
Okay. Oh, hopefully.
oh, you can hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think this must have gone through a bit of a dark patch on the road. I was saying that like my sense of the chapter is that it's just a piece in the book of the whole of the book. If the book is trying to say or chart this conceptual history of ideas from the Macy conferences and or in the 20th century to this mechanized conception of mind that we now have. This chapter for me is a step in that process where we have a particular understanding of knowledge that's expressed in science, and but even deeper is this cultural principle of verum factum, and that on this basis we have this kind of, we're going to be thinking about things going to have a particularly mechanized sense to it, where so we say, okay, if if to know something is to be able to create something or create a model of it, we find in Turing's Turing machine model a very mechanized conception of an algorithmic process, which is easy to identify analogically or otherwise with the mind, and because it's this very precise procedure, it fits in it fits the scientific procedure of building a model of something, and it happens to be mechanized or describe a very mechanized procedure of computation. And we have grounds to believe it's a decent model for mind, and from that we get this mechanized picture of mind. I don't know. That's my smoothing over of a lot of bumps sense of this, the place of this chapter and the arc of the story. That how did we get to the mechanized mind? Well, we thought that knowing was simulating, and that's kind of the Turing machine model is just kind of the middle step there. I don't know if that was, that was a bit of a messy thing, but I don't know.
Yeah, I understand your point completely. As far as the general sort of placement of this part here into the whole of the conceptual sequence that he's building here, I think I'd agree. But the interesting thing is that this is definitely one of those books that's got multiple layers to it. That's also, I think, the first thing that Sebastian mentioned to me when he mentioned that we'll be covering this book, because on the one hand, it can be very imprecise in certain places, but on the other hand, maybe this is the more continental side of me speaking here, but I think there's something very valuable in that kind of breadth of content here, because sure, one can just read it exclusively as a history of cognitive science, and one could probably finish reading it in a day or two, but one could also then sort of focus on those specific areas, those specific places where he's imprecise, and where he leaves, where he sort of plants the seeds for very varied different reflections on the topic, and on multiple topics, in fact. So yeah, I think we shouldn't judge him too harshly on the basis of imprecision.
Totally. I mean, I still think that what he did, even just from a historical perspective, is magnificent. To be honest.
Yeah, I mean, we always, you know, in the history and prehistory of Epoché, this sort of reading group, we always covered books that are that have multiple layers to them, to put it simply. So it was always stuff like, I don't know, Merleau-Ponty, Mechanization of Perception, and then Whitehead, also Canguilhem, Goldstein. So, you know, often they were books which, especially in the case of Canguilhem and Goldstein, you know, can seem incredibly simple on first glance, you know, but then as you get into them, you sort of start to unravel everything that that the authors are developing. I suppose in some sense, if we are covering a book like that, then having a reading group to do it makes more sense than if we were doing someone who's, you know, completely 100% precise, because there's more sort of wiggle room, and I think it's probably more useful to have a discussion on everything if there is that sort of room for interpretation. Has anyone else got any other comments on what we've been talking about now? Something we mentioned before, maybe?
I think I might have an interesting observation or comment regarding the relationship between Husserl and...
I was waiting for that.
Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about what you said and about the differences at first, because it seems that for Husserl, this notion of approximation is very central to his notion of kind of genealogy of idealization. So that it's not enough just to abstract from phenomena, but that after we've become able to manipulate phenomena or to measure phenomena in a sufficient way, we can start disregarding the specific instantiations of the mathematical models that we use. And that's what he calls idealization, right? So you can think about phenomena not intending them in every single step of the way to an ultimate judgment upon something, some scientific question. So I was thinking, because to me it was it was extremely interesting that actually he started the chapter with this investigation and into how Herbert Simon was experiencing his trip to Europe, and I was reading it much more as a genealogy of how cognitive scientists not only came to use the computation as a metaphor, which he says that it was used mainly before Turing brought his notion of invented his notion of Turing machine, but actually to perceive nature as a natural phenomena as a just specific instantiation of a model of a Turing machine. So what's important for me is that, of course, before, like if we go back to Husserl, you had the abstraction, which was prevalent in Greek sciences. Okay, so you could abstract from certain phenomena and you could describe them more in a broader sense. So you could speak about specific mechanisms, you could speak about specific equations and such, but you always have this characteristic return to, okay, so now I developed a solution to an equation, but then I show that if we pick these specific numbers, we can solve the equation that was first given. But these specific numbers that solve as are used as a concrete proof are essential for the Greek development of scientific thinking, but seem rather not really necessary from our point of view. So what was needed to come to that point where it wasn't necessary to intend the solution with a particular phenomena, but rather to stay in the model itself, like with Husserl. So we have the idealization in which you stay and you're not concerned exactly how that, if that is completely connected to the phenomena itself. So basically what happens is exactly as he says on side 31, that in constructing models, scientists project their mind onto the world of things. So how can we come from the metaphorical understanding of computation to this model understanding of computation, where actually the projection becomes more powerful than mere metaphoric? Oh, as maybe let's think of thinking as if a computation was going on. So for me, this is the transition from logic, from formalistic logic, from a notion of this finalism and proving certain mathematical theorems, to actually arriving at a certain idealization of this finitistic understanding of solving mathematical problems or logical problems with the notion of the Turing machine. And what this does actually is that before, the notion of the human being was in a sense inseparable from the process of solving an equation, of going through the steps from propositions to this conclusion. But what happens with the Turing machine? All of a sudden, we're able to imagine that there's a thing that does this instead of us. So for me, what happens here is actually that it's not that Herbert Simon goes to France and says, oh, it is as if nature imitated art. No, for him, nature actually is imitating art because he's incapable of switching back to this metaphorical understanding of models, because of course he's one of the first he developed the first one of the first logic solving machines. So from his point of view, actually, it's not only that precisely because he invented a machine that could solve logical problems without his input, he can think of this model as kind of, how can one say, as being more capable than he himself is. So to me, the tension between abstraction and idealization, which is foreign to Dupuy, but very, very, very close to what Husserl tried to do with his analysis of history of science, is precisely this, that with abstraction, we use models as metaphors to help us think. But the crucial question is here, for me, how was it possible that logic as a metaphor for human thinking became actually in a sense, a model of human thinking itself, from which cognitive scientists weren't able to perceive anymore its metaphorical origins, in a sense. So that the Turing machine kind of changed the whole way everybody understood what logic is supposed to do. And for me, this is a great example, because in the beginning of the 20th century, you still have the Brouwerian intuitionism, where it's a big, and there exists a big tension between him and Hilbert, because Brouwer actually kind of opposes the merely kind of syntactic manipulation of science that Hilbert would want to introduce into mathematics. But what's happening now, and what's happened throughout the 20th century, is that actually the intuitionistic way of thinking was more and more incorporated into computer proof assistants, which in a sense then became more and more distant from what Brouwer was imagining in the first place. So he basically imagined that every mathematical object has to be constructed in our mind. It has to be clearly understood. But obviously, this has been disappearing in computational mathematics quite a lot. So to me, that's precisely what happened. So that the very idea about how a judgment or how a thinking process is supposed to function, it didn't only happen that we lost the difference between the model and the real world, but actually that something had to happen so that this became possible. And to me, this is the Turing machine. So before we had all the necessary abstractions, but in order to make them idealizations, we had to invent a certain way of having a procedure by which we could measure it. And that's the Turing machine. I hope this was kind of understandable.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I from the moment that I mentioned Husserl, I knew that your response was coming and you did not disappoint. Yeah, to me, it wasn't understandable. I add that I think that's in some way connected to the point on page 32, but this is of the old translation, because apparently I've got the wrong book or wrong edition, where he talks about how we had to renounce the Hobbesian notion of genetic definition. So in a sense, apart from the fact that we've got a radically new model, the model is not like previous models in the sense that we can't deduce all its properties from its definition. In a way, it opens up this sort of new paradoxical aspect to this. Yeah, of course, then, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and other aspects of this, it does open up onto a new horizon of the model being more real than we are, in a sense, more real than the phenomenon to which it refers. But there are always obstacles. One thing, just as a side note, is an interesting sort of tidbit. You probably all know about GPT, yeah, the viral chatbot, which is really fascinating. But sometimes it can give responses that are just ridiculous. And one of those was its response to the classical joke about a man at a Chinese restaurant who served shrimp fried rice, and he says, "Oh, I can't believe that a shrimp fried this rice." And in the example, ChatGPT is instructed to create a similar joke. And interestingly enough, ChatGPT does seem to sort of get why the joke is funny, but then when it tries to construct other variances, you know, it comes up with something like, "I can't believe that, I don't know, a mouse baked this pizza," or something. You know, it's completely nonsensical. It's absolutely removed from the point of the thing. But yeah, that is maybe a bit off topic, because it opens up the way that models like ChatGPT work, which is in one sense fascinating, but in another sense way simpler than most people would assume. Has anyone else got anything else to add?
I think it's we are left with a lot of materials to think about over the weekend.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm looking forward to what the next chapters will reserve. So I had no idea that I would be confronted with Husserl here. So
don't know if you mean that in a good or a bad way.
You know, it's surprising, and I think maybe I get from Gregor his copy and can have a look into it.
Gladly. Okay, I think I also need to run soon.
Okay, yeah, I think we can call it a day at this point. I see that we've got all the timeline is already filled in. So I know that one place was missing. So I don't know which one, but someone.
I filled in for the third chapter, I think.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Moritz.
It fit to my interests.
Hmm.
Just an organizational question that I had was like, is there a specific reason why we have this meeting on Friday this late? Because I always have a little bit the feeling I would be more cognitively capable of doing it. We did it a little earlier. Is that something that is possible for all, or is there a specific reason we have it at 6?
I personally don't really know. I will have to check with Sebastian if he would be fine with a earlier meeting, but I don't know. I can tell him that suggestion. What about the people here? You can just if earlier, so something like 4 in the afternoon, or maybe even 5, even though that's not that much earlier. So something around 4 or 5, if that would be okay, or rather, if that would not be okay, just say it. It's not a problem. We can stick to this one. Okay. Okay, then I'll check with Sebastian, and if it is an option, I think I would also be a bit more cognitively capable, especially with a multifaceted work such as this one.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Again, don't know yet. We'll check, but if possible, we could do that. So yeah, thanks once again for volunteering for chapter 3. We've got the timeline completely filled in now, and thank you all for attending. And I look forward to our meeting next time in 2 weeks. We'll be back to using the old Zoom link. The only reason we're using this one this time is because Sebastian couldn't make it today, and he's got, it was on his Zoom account, so obviously someone needs to step in. So yeah, thank you all for attending. Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.